Hello everybody, my name is Daryl Obert and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch my Xgen webinar. So today we're going to spend about 45 minutes going through a variety of topics in Xgen, and I'm going to be sharing with you tips and tricks along the way that I've picked up over the last year of working with the tool. The range of skill level covered in this Xgen webinar will start off with very simple things and end with slightly more complex things. So this is not a 101 tutorial on how to use Xgen if you've never touched it, but we will cover off some basic things that would be useful for a novice Xgen user, as well as some topics that are a little bit more advanced. So hopefully no matter what your skill level is, you'll pick up something inside of this webinar that you can apply to your work. So in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you tips and tricks on how to do 3 different unique effects inside of Maya. We're going to be using Xgen to do a short hair effect, a long hair effect, and a geometry instancing effect. The first shot that we're going to be doing is adding fur onto this tiger, and this is the most basic example that we're going to be looking at today. So I'll be showing and explaining some of the Xgen user interface along the way in this shot. So the first thing you got to do is get the Xgen window to load up on the right hand side of Maya, and you can do this by going to the Xgen shelf and clicking the leftmost icon to open the Xgen window, or you can simply go to the Xgen drop down from the top menu bar and say open Xgen window. So once you do that, the Xgen tab will be there and you can select a piece of geometry and create a new Xgen description. So the idea is the descriptions have a meaningful name and they're included in a collection, and you can have multiple descriptions in a given collection. So for the tiger, we might have a description called fur, another description for the whiskers, and maybe a third description for the eyelashes, all contained inside of the collection for that tiger. So after you get your naming set up properly, the next thing you need to do is tell Xgen what type of primitives you want to have instanced on your current selection. And this is going to be based on the type of effect that you're trying to achieve. So for long hair, we'd use splines. For short hair or fur, we'd use groomable splines. For set population or set dressing, we'd use custom geometry or archives. And then we can use simple spheres or cards to do some basic things. The cards are kind of cool in Maya 2015 because in Viewport 2.0, we can now accurately capture the texturing information. So we can have diffuse and transparent information on those cards showing up in the viewport. Keep in mind that these cards also have a bunch of attributes on them that allow you to adjust them so that they can have bend or twist or change their shape and position on the surface. So they're really quite powerful inside of Xgen and Maya. So after you've told Xgen what type of geometry you want to instance or what primitive you want to use, the next thing you need to do is kind of give it some information about how you want that to be dispersed across the surface. So do you want it to be random in uniform rows or columns, or just at points that you specify? Finally, you have to give Xgen some information about how you want to interact or control those primitives. So you can either use guide shapes to do that, or you can simply use numerical values in the form of attributes and expressions. The last choice is to use the grooming tools, and this is specific to doing a groomable spline workflow. So as soon as we click on groomable splines, you can see the grooming tools are automatically selected for us and all the other options are grayed out. So this is going to use a brush-based workflow to allow us to interact and position the overall instance splines that we're going to end up rendering. So we'll go ahead and create that. It'll take just a second for Maya to do that. And what we're now displayed with in the viewport is a graphical representation of these groomable splines. So we'll just increase the density of those guys a little bit up to something a little bit higher, like a value of 10. So these groomable splines are being shown to us in the form of a simple icon. And basically what they're going to be doing is controlling the overall shape of our instance geometry. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through each one of these tabs and give you a quick overview of them before we go any further. So the primitives tab really is the geometry that's being instanced. We can adjust the overall density of that, and we can also change lots of different attributes that go into making up the overall look and feel of those primitives. We can also specify at this point what type of primitive we want to instance. Now for this example, because we're doing fur, we're going to go ahead and leave this on splines. And you'll notice that a lot of these attributes are being driven by mapping operations. The reason they're being driven by mapping operations is the grooming tools capture that grooming information in the form of texture maps, and then those texture maps drive our instance geometry by mapping themselves into their appropriate attributes associated with those primitives. Pretty straightforward. So the next tab is the Preview Output tab. So this displays and adjusts what the primitive objects are going to do as far as their preview in the viewport, as well as what they're going to be output as. So by default, it's set to output as a rendering operation, but this could be changed. Xgen could output point files, particle files, maybe mel files that will give you actual geometry where all the instances are on set dressing or something like that. So there's lots of different things that you can use to have this output different options. Further down the Output tab is also different parameters that you can check on and off that will get included in the output, as well as some custom shader parameters that we'll look at a bit later in this further description. So the next tab is the Modifiers tab. So modifiers allow you to start layering complexity on top of the instance splines. So things like clumping, noise, cutting, all these things go into making a more natural looking groom on your character, and that's all done with using these modifiers that you layer on top of the instance geometry. It's super powerful and really, really quite cool. So the next tab we already saw briefly, which is the Grooming tab. So this allows us to choose what brush we want to use to do our groom, as well as various settings that will go into the overall effect of how that's represented in the viewport, as well as the way the maps are saved out. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. Utilities tabs are if you were doing a guide-based workflow. So this allows a lot of different options for working with the guides, turning the guides into standard Maya curves, or maybe taking standard Maya curves and turning those back into guides. Tons of power inside of here. And I'll be going into this a little bit more throughout the year on my blog. I'm going to follow up this webinar with blog posts throughout the year, and I'll dive into these guides a bit later because they're super duper powerful. And we won't have enough time to go over them today in the 45 minutes that we have. So then the Expressions tab allows you to define a global expression that then could be referenced back into multiple attributes, right? So you might write one expression for a random noise generator that we want to have drive length and width at the same time. So that's an easy way of doing something like that by using the Expressions tab. It's important to understand that all these attributes underneath it all are being driven by expressions. That's the core power of Xgen, right? So even though there's a slider here for me to adjust taper and taper start on my instance geometry, that's really being generated by an expression. That user interface inside of this primitives attribute section is being generated by this expression, and the value is basically getting recorded and passed on to the instance geometry. So this is really powerful, and we'll see a lot more examples of expressions and adding user interface elements with expressions a bit further on in the presentation. So it's important to realize that even something like a mapping operation is also, again, just a simple expression. It's the expression to load a map. It's looking to our working directory inside the groom folder, inside the width, to get all that brush-based work that we're capturing, driving the width of that object or the length of that object once we go ahead and create the true preview. So what we've got here is we've got groomable splines displayed in our viewport. If we hit our preview button, we're going to generate the actual instance geometry. So right now we just have an icon that represents what that instance geometry may look like, and then when we hit the preview button, we get the true instance primitive spline, which comes in as a shaded tube. Now you'll notice that this spline is a little bit fatter and it has that taper that we set there, and the groomable splines aren't really accurately representing the overall width of what that primitive geometry looks like. So this is the first tip. Go to your Grooming tab, we'll clear this guy out here, and set this to be cards. So when you put it to cards, the width value actually is represented correctly. So if we put this to a value of 0.05, you'll see that they get a little bit thinner there. So this is the actual width value that we're seeing on our cards that ultimately gets passed to our instance geometry in the form of this texture map driving width. So keep that in mind. It's a really easy change, but it makes a big difference. The next thing that I want to do is I just want to increase my TPU. This stands for texels per unit. Everything that we're doing inside of Xgen is using ptex maps. Everything that Xgen understands is ptex maps. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. So we're going to increase that up to something like a value of 15, so we'll have a slightly higher resolution to the groom maps that will get saved out as we start to use our brush-based tools to sculpt the overall look and feel of our tiger's fur. So I'm going to increase the length out to like a value of 1. We're going to have some pretty long, 0.8 is fine. We'll have some pretty long hair on our tiger, and I'll grab this pose tool And I'm just going to increase the density up to something like 30. And we'll increase the size of this pose tool. And I'm just going to use this to really quickly start to add in a little bit of variation to the position and orientation of the groomable splines here so that our fur has a little bit more style to it, a little bit more character to it. And I'm using a really big brush here to do this, which is fine for a lot of the areas, but you'll notice in certain areas as I kind of brush across this, like right there, when the brush was coming across his chest and then it sort of hit into his leg there, it kind of caved that in, and it pushed those groomable splines below the surface of our tiger, and that's not really what we want to have happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and fix that with a really cool tool, a really great mapping tool that's inside of here called elevation. And this is a real workhorse. So you grab this elevation tool, you decrease that brush size down by holding the B key to something a little bit smaller, increase that degree a good bit, and then I can just go in here and I can actually start to pull up that area really easily using that elevation tool. And that really just goes through and it sort of stops those groomable splines from passing through. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to adjust the overall length here. So I don't want long fur on my character's face. So I'm going to go to the length painting tool, and you'll notice that the goal length that we're trying to get to is a value of 5. So it's higher than we currently are. So I'm going to set that goal value down to something low, like a value of 0.1. And if I start painting on this guy, notice that nothing happens. So the problem with this is I'm trying to go to a lower value. And the way you get to a lower value is you need to set the increment to a negative value. So it's a little bit strange, but once you know it's that way, you can work around it pretty easily. So making that increment value go to a negative value allows me to paint from a high length to a low length. So just keep that in mind when you're working with painting length on your characters' descriptions. You gotta set that increment value into the negative range if you're trying to go from a high value or a large length to a lower length. And like I said, once you know about it, it's not that bad. So I'm just sort of painting a little bit of shorter length in some areas here. And like I said before, I'm not trying to get the best looking groom on this character. It's more about the tips and tricks than anything else. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to capture the left-hand side grooming that we did onto the right side of the character. It's very important that your character is facing down the front window, because the front window really is where these flipping operations happen from. So if my character wasn't orientated properly, I'd be flipping from the tail to the head, which really wouldn't be right. So just make sure your character is facing down the front window. That's my next tip there. So with all that done, we can go ahead and turn off the visibility of those groomable splines and click our preview button one more time. I'm actually going to go back to my preview tab and increase the density of this guy. So you'll notice that density is pushed up to a value of 30. That's because when I hit my groom, I set its density to 30. So Maya will automatically take the density value that you set from your grooming and assign it to your primitive geometry that's going to be instanced. Now you can always make this have a higher value, which is pretty standard, right? Like for your grooming, you might want to work with a slightly lower density value than what you're actually going to go out and try to render. You're going to render thousands of hairs. You might want to groom with hundreds of hairs. So keep that in mind. So if we hit the preview button one more time, what we're going to get now is going to be something that looks pretty cool. All right, so that looks all right. I want to further modify this. So I want to make it a little bit thinner. I want the strands or the primitive instance geometry to be a little bit thinner. So if you remember, this is being driven by that length map, right? So if we go back to our grooming, and you would think that I could just say, you know what, let me change this value to a value of 0.2, and that would actually capture that change. Unfortunately, this is sort of I'd say it's almost like a workflow issue or maybe even a bug. These values won't get transferred back into that mapping information unless visibility is turned on. So you just have to make sure that visibility is turned on before you change that value for it to actually get transferred over to the map, which ultimately then drives the primitive shape. So just keep that in mind. And you know what, while those are visible, I'm just going to grab this elevation brush. We'll clear this out here. I'm going to use that elevation brush. Oops, let's undo that. We'll use that elevation brush to pull out that range right there where it was caving in a little bit. I didn't like that. All right, so with that done, what we're going to do is we're going to turn off that display, and we'll go back and we'll hit that preview one more time. So it takes just a couple seconds for this to happen. And you'll notice that once the preview loads and finishes up here, what we're displaying on the viewport is actually the default shader that's associated with these primitive splines. And it doesn't really capture the overall look and feel of this tiger very well at all. So what we want to do is we want to have some texturing information drive the effect of each instance spline. And this is really pretty straightforward to do. If we go to our Preview Output tab, you'll notice that in the preview settings we have primitive color. And this is an important concept. You have the ability to have the primitives in your preview represented with one set of mapping information, and the software rendering or the output settings use another set of mapping information. And this allows you to have the interactive view maybe do some diagnostics or something like that, and have the actual software renderer use the finished shader looks or shader maps that you want. So that's why it's broken out into two separate categories. For this example, what we're going to do is we're going to build everything up as far as our color information is concerned in the preview output section, in the preview section, and then we're going to copy that information to the output section where the software renderer can pick it up after we've got it looking good in the preview window. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get rid of that display there, and we're going to get rid of this region map that's driving our primitive color, and we're just going to create a new map. So when we hit the Create Map button, really what we're doing is we're actually, again, using an expression to pipe a map into this and load the 3D Paint tool. So we'll set our texel resolution up to something like a value of 10. We'll call this Color DT, and we'll go ahead and create that guy. So as soon as we do that, our hardware lighting gets turned off, so I'll hit my 7 key to turn that stuff back on, and we'll pull up our 3D Paint tool. So anybody that's used Maya knows that the 3D Paint tool is a UV-based tool. And if you remember me mentioning earlier that Xgen works exclusively with p-tex textures, so there's a little bit of a problem there, and we have a button that basically solves that problem for us. So if I just go ahead and I paint this little texture map on my character, and I click the Save button, you'll notice that in the Save button it also says Bake p-tex Maps to Disk. So even though I've just painted on the, using a UV-based tool, as soon as I hit this Save button, what we've done is we've converted that to a p-tex file and saved it off the disk. So now when we hit our Preview button, Xgen can reference to that p-tex file and use that to drive the color of each instance spline. Now that's all well and good if I wanted to manually paint every, the color maps on my character, and that's not really desired in this effect. I already have an awesome color map of those tiger stripes on the shader for this character. So what we're going to do is a pretty cool little trick or hack to basically grab that texture map and pipe it into this node, this kind of workflow, and have it get converted to a p-tex map directly inside of Maya without actually having to go out to something like Mudbox to generate the p-tex map. So this is a pretty cool trick. So let's go ahead and blow away our preview of that guy, grab our piece of geometry that's got the shader associated with it, go to our node editor and just graph that guy. So you'll see that, let's just hit our 5 key and clear that up here. You'll see that we've got piped into this guy, we've got this map, and if we hit 2 on this guy and 2 on this guy, you'll see that the out color is being thrown into this DT color attribute that we added onto that Xgen description. So all we have to do is go grab our texture map of our fur and repipe this guy in. So we're going to grab the out color of this guy and shove it into that guy. So now we've got the right map going into that custom color attribute that we've defined here. So all we have to do is just go ahead and hit the Save button, because again, that's going to convert UV maps to p-tex maps. And now, in a few seconds, we'll hit the Preview button, and we're going to get the Xgen description, each instance piece of geometry getting its color from that original texture map that's assigned to the shader on our character. So it's a pretty cool little trick to hijack that Convert button and have it use any texture map inside of your scene. So now you can see we've got, some pretty awesome looking fur showing up in Viewport 2.0 on our tiger. So the next thing that we need to do is get this information down into the software renderer. So you remember I mentioned that when I hit that Create Map button, it really was just writing an expression to tie that attribute to a map. That map's been saved to this path on disk, and then that's the command to pull up the 3D Paint tool at a texel resolution of 10. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this guy and we're going to copy it because we don't want to redo that work. We're just going to basically go down to our output settings and pass this information into the shading network. So this again is another kind of quirky workflow inside of Xgen, but once you know about it, it's really quite powerful. What I want to do is I want to have each individual instance piece of geometry be driven by a custom attribute, a custom shader attribute called root color. So there's custom shading attributes for the root color and the tip color. If you provide Maya only with the root color, the whole spline all the way down the length of it's going to be that same root color. If you give it a root color and a tip color, it'll interpolate down the length of that spline. So you can have the base of it look one color and the tips of it become another color. So it's very powerful. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch this from float to color. And the naming of this is very important. So just call it root underscore color. And we'll go ahead and we'll hit the create button on this guy. And in this, we're just going to change that attribute to be driven by that expression that we made earlier that's basically driving the preview of our character's Viewport 2.0 display. So we'll bring up our render view and we'll just click the render last button here and we'll get our nice tiger effect happening. So here you can see the final gather pass comes through and then the final render pass comes through. And this is just lit with a simple sun sky system, so there's really nothing fancy happening here. I've got the exposure cranked down a little bit, so we're just rendering this out as a linear file, and then there's an sRGB profile put on the render view. So that tiger looks like I got the fur a little bit too long there. He looks a little fluffy and fat, but still pretty cool effect. I think the specularity might be a slight bit too hot on that, but it gives you a quick introduction to working with Xgen and a couple of tips and tricks when doing short hair effects inside of Maya. Next, we're going to be looking at some tips and tricks for working with longer hair inside of Xgen. So what we want to do is we want to have a new hair description added to our character that's going to basically try to match the overall look and feel that I have in this modeled geometry. And this is going to be done using a tube groom workflow. So this gives us a very art-directable approach to generating the guides that ultimately drive our instance splines for our longer hair. So let's go ahead and select the piece of geometry, which is our character's scalp, and you'll notice that I've limited the number of faces. This is a good thing for workflow, to always try to have the least number of faces that you're going to use to generate your descriptions from. And we're going to go and create a new description for that selection, and we'll call it Hair 3, and we'll put this in the folder called Sven for the collection, and it's going to be a spline for long hair, and we're going to be placing this using guides. So we'll go ahead and we'll create that. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to get some guides into our scene. So instead of using the drop guide button or add guide button, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Primitives tab inside of the Primitives attributes and click the Tube Groom button. So this is going to give me a widget that will allow me to load in all the geometry that was modeled off to generate these tubes. Notice that this geometry is open on both ends. So it's open on this end and it's also open on if we hit our 4 key there, you can see on the back side. So they're essentially tubes that are opened on both ends there, and they're very close to the geometry that we're trying to have the guides generated from. So what we can do is we can just go ahead and grab every piece that we want to have added in as a tube. So we'll grab these back guys too. And with that done, all we have to do is go ahead and click the button here to load the list into the tubes column. So now we can go ahead and click our test button, and it's going to give us a representation of a little X where each guide is going to get added, as well as a number here. So it's going to add guides around the outside edge of each of these tubes, and a guide down the middle of each of the tubes the way I currently have it set, or a few guides down the middle of each of the tubes where I currently have it set. So that's a little bit high as far as the guide number. I'm going to go ahead and increase this number and hit the test button one more time, and you'll see that's going to lower the overall number of guides down a little bit. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. We'll go ahead and we'll hit the generate button. So what Maya is going to do now is it's going to go through and generate our guides for us. And it's also going to save out a region map for each one of these tubes. And the region maps are useful because they allow us to have good control over what instance geometry is going to get controlled by which guides, be based on those region maps. So it's really pretty awesome. So what we've got shown in our viewport now is obviously the instance geometry got added in there, and if we start to increase the overall density of those guys, you'll start to see what they look like. So we'll get that density up a little bit higher. Maybe we'll drop down that width to 0.05, and we'll give it a little bit of taper and a little bit of taper start. So one problem that we have is, even though the instance geometry is kind of following those tube grooms pretty well, it's actually being generated from everywhere on that scalp. So we want to isolate where that hair can grow from. And this is something that's really easy to do inside of Maya by just simply painting this mask file. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and grab all of our tubes, and we're going to grab our scalp. Let's grab our tubes and we'll grab our scalp, and we'll jump into our view selected mode. And we'll just grab this guy and we'll jump in here and say create map. So we're going to create a black map, and we're going to paint where we want the hair to actually come from. So we'll jump into our 3D paint tool. So make sure that your brush profile type is set to be a solid brush. These gradient brushes actually go to a gradient all the way to the very center point. So if you don't use a solid brush, the mask files can get a little flaky. So again, we want to paint with a value of white where we want to generate that hair from. So we can close that guy down and go through here and just start adding in. And I'll just increase my brush size to be pretty broad with my painting here in this first pass. And then I'll go back and cut it back in using my smaller brush holding down my control key. So I'm just going to try to, broadly get the overall effect that we want to have happen here pretty quickly, and then decrease that brush size and do some cut back work holding down that control key. So we'll just kind of bleed that guy back and bleed that guy back a little bit there. And again, I don't need to be too precise with this. This is more about the concept than the actual end result here. So that looks pretty good. Happy with that. So just like we did before, these are UV-based textures until we hit the save button. As soon as we hit the save button, it becomes a p-text texture. And if we get out of our isolate select mode, you can see now our hair is being limited to where it's growing from based on that mask file that we just painted, which is exactly what we want to have happen. So the next thing that we're going to do is just go ahead and hide those tubes. We don't need to see those guys anymore. We want to begin working with those region maps a little bit more to get a good representation as to where they actually exist. So if we jump back to our Xgen description, I mentioned the fact that region map was saved out for me automatically. What we're going to do is we're going to go to that preview output tab, and we're going to start to change our guide colors to actually be driven by that region map. So this is something that's pretty easy to do because that region map is already a p-text file. So what we're going to do is we're going to say load expression. Remember I talked about the fact that everything in Maya with Xgen is actually being an expression, whether it's a map or a slider or a color value. They're all made, and all the UI is made with expressions. So we have a sample expression under the UI setting for loading p-text maps. So we'll go ahead and we'll grab that guy. And you can see those guides went to black, right? Because we haven't mapped anything into that directory right now. It's kind of a blank directory. So if we just browse out to where we saved out that Sven directory, which is in this guy, Maya's already made a region map for me. I just need to load it and point this to it. So inside of Sven, in Hair 3 in Region, if we hit select, you'll now see that each guide, based on that tube where those guides were derived from, has unique colors. So that means any hair that is in that region is going to, any primitive splines that are within that region are going to be controlled by those curves with the same color. So that's pretty cool. Now we could take this same expression that we're using to drive our guides and have that, by copying it, I just hit Control C on that guy, also drive our primitive color. And again, I talked about this in that first example where you might have the primitive color being driven by something like a region map, and the shader color is being driven by something else that the output renderer is going to use. So this is a perfect example of that. So we're going to go ahead and see, let's load this expression window up, and we'll add into that expression that we just copied and say accept. And now you can see that our hair, we're getting this nice visual representation as to which hair is going to be controlled by which guides and which hair is going to be in which region. The other thing that's kind of cool about this is if we hide that preview of that hair and we go back to our Add Guides button and I start to drag this around, you'll see that little guide sort of lagging behind my cursor, or hopefully the Camtasia is picking that up. And the guide is actually getting color changed to give me a good visual representation as to where I'm going to add in more detail, where I'm going to add another groomable spline, or where I'm going to add another guide curve that's going to basically adjust the overall effect of that hair and give me more control of it in that region. And you'll see that when I let go of that button, it adds in that new guide, and that guide interpolates between all of its neighbors. So that visual feedback and that color feedback is really quite useful when you're working with your hair inside of Maya in Viewport 2.0. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start to further modify this hair using modifiers. So a couple things about modifiers. You always want to start with broad detail and go to finer detail, whether you're dealing with clumps or noise. You want to start with broad detail and go to finer detail. And another thing that's worth mentioning is the clumping effects always happen first. After that, then things like all the other effects you can reorder, but the clumping effects are always going to be at the front of the list no matter what you do. So we're going to go ahead and work that way up and just add the clumps first anyway. So we'll go ahead and we'll grab our first clumping. And when you generate a clump, you need to specify how big that clump is going to be. How big is the clumping going to be? So the first thing you got to do is go down to your setup parameters in the setup maps. And we can use either a density value to generate this, or we can just use our guide curve. So if we hit generate, this is with a density of 1. That's how big my clumps are going to be. Obviously, if I increase the density and hit generate one more time, we'd get finer clumps. What I want to do is I want those clumps to actually be driven from the guide. So when I click that guide button, it's going to go ahead and put a clump everywhere there was a guide curve. So with that done, we can go ahead and save that out. And you can see now what we have is we have this nice clumping happening. So there's no scaling effect happening at the root, and it's scaling down to a value of 0 at the tip. Inside of the clump, there's control for noise and cut and copy effects. These are happening at the clump level. So if we go to cut and we add in a random slider or a random expression, I'll just type rand, enter 0 to 3 or 4 and hit accept. This is actually happening at the clump level. So we're cutting that down at the clump level as opposed to cutting at the individual instance spline level, which would happen if we did a cut effect outside of the clumping. So keep in mind that the effects that you see inside of clumping will behave differently than if they were individual effects layered after the clump. This happens actually to the whole clump, essentially. So the other thing that we might want to do is add a little bit of noise to this guy. So if we give it a noise, we'll put a noise value of 1 in there. We'll give it a frequency of something that's kind of low, like a value of 1. This is going to start to just break this up here a little bit. We'll add that noise to the tips of our hair. And right now, we're not seeing a lot of detail added in, and that's because there's not that many CVs on this. So we're going to increase the CVs so that we can start to capture some of that finer detail. You know, maybe put this up to something like 40. And it'll start to capture all that finer detail that we've added into this guy. So we've got this sort of noise effect happening, and we've got that clumping effect happening. Now, I don't really like the clumping scaling down to a value of 0 on that tip, so we're just going to increase that a little bit, and we'll go ahead and we'll drop this noise down a little bit. I don't want that noise to be that extreme, but I do want it to be introduced lower into the hair here. So we want to have just a little subtle wave happening in those clumps, and that little bit of scaling effect happening as they sort of scale down toward the tips. And we've got a little bit of random cutting happening here. That might be a little extreme. We'll put that to a value of 1. And we'll re-execute that guy out. So with that done, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add another set of clumping. Now remember I said you always want to work from broad detail to fine detail. So this next clump that we're going to add is going to be a little bit smaller, and we're going to do some other effects with it. So we'll go ahead and we'll add another clumping effect on top. So we're kind of layering clumps on top of each other. So once we get that new clump on there, we need to go set up our maps again, like I said before. And what we're going to do is we're going to increase the density of this guy. We'll hit generate on that, so it's pretty good. It's going to be, I like that density value there. So we'll go ahead and we'll save that out. And at any time, if I want to get a preview of what that clump is actually looking like, I can turn color preview on. So you can see that's really pretty subtle clumps that we've added into that guy. So we've got broad clumps with some finer subclumps added onto it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this offset effect to start to add in, we're going to use the offset effect to add in a little bit of kind of pull out in the middle range right here. So if I start to increase this offset, you can see there's 0 effect at the root and 0 effect at the tip. But if I add in a value of like 0.5 here, you're going to see that it's going to start to pull these guys out in that middle range and sort of kind of plump those guys out a little bit in that middle range. So it just sort of makes it kind of weird and wavy in that middle range, which I kind of like. So after that's done, we can go ahead and start to add in maybe a cut effect. So this cut effect that we add outside of the clumping is actually going to be at a per instance level or a per primitive level. So if we put this to a value of like, I don't know, 1.2 or 2.2, it's going to start to trim those hairs back a little bit. Maybe we'll jump into this clumping here and we'll just not have that scale all the way down to a value of 0. That's a little extreme. That's cool. I like that. And we can turn off that color preview when we don't need to see that anymore. So we just have the region preview happening there now. So the last thing that we're going to do is I'm going to add on one more noise just to make the hair kind of frizzy or kinky or something like that. So I talked about you want to work from broad detail to fine detail. So with noise, you want to work from kind of low frequency to high frequency. So we've already got sort of a low frequency wave happening at the clump level. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a high frequency noise that happens on a per strand basis that kind of goes across the whole head, not just at a clump level. So that noise comes in. It's got a frequency of a value of 1. We could increase that up to something even higher, like a value of 2. And you can see that it's really frizzing the tips of the hair because it's going from 0 effect to full effect at the end or the tips of the hair. So I'm just going to turn that magnitude down. I like it going from tip to end, but I don't want it to be quite that extreme. I just want to have it be a little bit less crazy there. And obviously, if we put this up to something like, you know, a value of 5, right, it's going to get totally nuts and blow that hair out on the ends, right? So lots of control that you have using these modifiers to really fine-tune the look and feel of your hair. And again, the concepts are always the same. You work from broad detail to small detail, high frequency or low frequency to high frequency. It's all sort of the same ideas here. So at any given time, if I want to, I can go ahead and go back to my primitives and get rid of that color information that we're using in our preview. So you know what? I'm just going to say, let's load a new expression, sample, UI, and we'll just load a gray or a black. Doesn't really matter. It's going to give me a color slider back to that guy for our primitive preview, and then we can just sort of drop that down to a very low res, and we can hide the overall guides. We don't need to see those anymore. So those are just a couple of examples of things that you can do with Xgen for working with longer hair inside of Maya 2015. In the next example, we're going to be talking about geometry instancing using Xgen, and I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks to help you be successful with it. So the first thing you need to do is generate your custom archives, and this is really easy to do inside of Maya, but there are a couple things that you might not be aware of that can help you out here. So the first thing that you want to be able to do is make sure that the Poly Reduce tool works inside of Maya on the actual piece of geometry. If you're trying to use the Xgen export selection as archives, you'll notice that there is a level of detail. So if you put automatic poly reduction turned on and Maya, the poly reduce tool inside of Maya proper doesn't work, this will basically fail and not generate your archive for you and not tell you. So you'll try to load it up later and it won't work and you won't know why. So the first thing you got to do is make sure that you can run a poly reduce command on that piece of geometry and have it actually be successful before you do the Xgen export if you're trying to use that level of detail, which is pretty cool. The level of detail allows the geometry as it gets further away based on a distance that you set automatically switch out to lower reses of the geometry. So it's something that the primitive instancer can do inside of Xgen, and if you have geometry that's sort of saved out using that automatic method, it's really easy to set up. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is like you basically have a piece of geometry, and let's just say this is AP1, and I think that's good. I'm ready to go. I hit the return key and the window closes, and I think I just saved out my Xgen archive. I didn't just save out my Xgen archive. So this is something that's kind of funky. When you hit the return key, when you change the name in a field, it actually closes the window, but it doesn't do the actual export. So you actually have to hit the export button. Now, the other thing that's also worth mentioning is these archives can be saved in a variety of different locations, actually pretty much anywhere, but there's a few predefined paths that are set here for you, and you can see when you click on these guys, they kind of give you a good idea of where they're going to go. So in my login directory, in my archives, I go ahead and say export, and then it's going to ask, off it goes. You see the processing bar, you know it's good. So that's just a couple of tips for exporting out geometry as custom archives. Okay, so now we're back inside of Maya, and what we want to do is start to instance those archives that we just saved out onto our alien landscape. And this is actually going to be the most complex example that we've seen so far. We're going to be using some pretty cool expressions to allow us to paint color maps that will specify exactly where each archive is going to end up. So it's a pretty cool example of taking the out-of-box tools that Xgen are and adding to them with just a couple of simple lines of expression code to give us this functionality that it doesn't have natively. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and select the piece of geometry that we want to have our instanced archives spread across, and then we'll create a new Xgen description from that selection. So we'll just tell this to be in a new collection called, I don't know, something like fun, and it's going to be geometry-based archives, and we'll place those using guides. So it'll take Maya a little bit of time to go through and add this new description and collection into our scene. So we'll load up the Xgen window. And it's a good idea to go ahead and set your density down to a very low value when you're dealing with archives in geometry. This way you won't accidentally flood your scene with billions of polygons and have Viewport 2.0 try to handle that. So I always like to set my density low and then sort of work my way up from there. So with that done, we're going to go ahead and start to add in a few guide shapes. So these are just going to be 1 unit size cubes that are going to adjust the overall position, orientation, and scaling of our instance geometry. So if I want them to be a little bit bigger in the background, I can just grab that guide and scale it up. And it'll interpolate between those guides just like the hair primitives were able to interpolate between the guides that controlled it. So with that done, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and jump down to our archive section and start to load in some archive files. So if we jump up a level here and go into Xgen collection, Xgen archives, and we'll grab the fern, the mushroom, and I don't know, this reef. So we're just going to grab 3 of them. That's enough to kind of drive the point home of what we're doing here. And we bring those in. Maya's going to go ahead and ask if we want to load the shaders. Of course we do. New in 2015 is the ability for Maya to also show the texture maps on the archives in Viewport 2.0. So that's actually really helpful. And you'll notice that each one of these archives has an index number associated with it, 0, 1, and 2. Right now, the archive's index is randomly being picked between this range of 0, 1, and 2 with just this simple expression, right? So instead of having this information drive the overall position or what archive is going to get placed where, we want to have some maps that we actually paint drive this index number. So we need to build a little machine that allows us to take color information and turn it into index information and have that ultimately drive this index attribute on the primitives. So this is something that we're going to do with a couple of expressions. So we'll jump over to our expression tab, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a color expression that's going to basically hold the map that we're going to paint for each individual archive. So we'll go ahead and we'll create this, and the names that you need to call this are actually relatively specific because my expressions are hardwired. So I'm going to give you guys these expressions that you can load very simply into Maya, and they'll be posted on my blog on the area. It's called The Desk. For those of you who haven't been there, go check it out. There's lots of tutorials that I have on there, and by the time this webinar is up, I'll have a blog post done sort of replicating the exact same thing that we're discussing right now, and the expressions will be accessible there, where you can just copy and paste them in and save them to your local directory so that you have them also. So the first thing we're going to do is add the color map that we're going to, or the expression to generate the color map that we're going to use to paint where we want the different archives to exist. So it's called a color map with a capital C and a capital M. So we'll go ahead and create this new expression, which again is going to ultimately just be a texture map that we're going to paint. And then the next thing that we want to do is create another custom expression that's going to just simply be a float. And we want this float to, this one's going to hold the machine that takes a color map information and turns it into an index number instead of a red, green, or blue color or whatever we set. So we're going to call this one a color. So with a color made as a float, we'll go ahead and add that to our custom expression. And now we need to start adding some information into these placeholders, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say load expression, and we're going to load this a color index. So as soon as we do that, what we're going to get is a bunch of sliders added for us. So if you remember, I talked about this at the very beginning, that everything from the user interface is also generated using expressions. If we look at the expression here, you can see that the first thing we're doing is defining a variable, $a, and we're telling that it's equal to a color map. So that's what's bringing in that color map information. And then from there, we've got the generation of the tolerance slider, and we're saying that a color 0 is equal to red, a color 1 is equal to green, a color 2 is equal to blue, and then a color 3 is equal to black, a color 4 is equal to 111. And we're basically taking that information and basically using that to define the colors that we want to paint in our texture map and associate what index number, which are right down here, they're going to get turned into. So this is really just a little machine that takes color map information, and instead of having a red, green, blue value there, it assigns an index number to that color where that color exists, essentially. And there's a little tolerance slider that lets it get, if we're in a range, it'll be close enough to it, it'll become that index number. So that's what we do there. So let's go ahead and paint our map. So we'll go into this and we'll say create map, and we'll paint a white map. That's fine for now. So let's go ahead and hit 7 to get our hardware lighting turned back on. So I've only got three archives in my scene. So we're just going to paint red, green, and blue. And wherever I paint red, it's going to be my first archive, green will be my second archive, and blue will obviously be my third archive. So we'll bring up our 3D paint tool here. And it looks like we're set to paint blue by default. Make sure that your map again is set to be a hard-edged map. So we'll paint some blue information over here, and maybe a little bit more blue sort of in this area. Then we'll jump back over here and we'll paint some green, kind of running through that area right there. And then we'll finish off by painting some red, maybe over here, and a little bit back in that area right there. So with that done, we have to go ahead and hit the save button that converts that to a PTEX file. Again, something that we've discussed a couple times here. So we'll save that out as a PTEX file. And now that we've got that all hooked up, the next thing that we need to do is just jump back to our Primitives tab and change what's driving this index random number generator. Instead of being a random number generator, we're going to go ahead and load up that other expression. Now you remember I said at any time you can save an expression out. This is where the expressions get saved to, your user login directory, Xgen, exe expression. So you can see here are the expressions that I'm going to send you. And that's where you put them, and then they'll just show up in your list. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch this. Instead of being driven from that, we're going to get the primitive index for map expression and have that drive that guy. So as soon as we do that, if we go ahead and hit 7 one more time here, you can see wherever there's red, we're getting the old fern. Wherever there's green, we're getting the mushroom, and wherever there's blue, we're getting that little weird alien plant thing. So if we go ahead and we increase this density up to a value of 0.1, we can make that a little bit more dense so it's a little bit clearer what's actually happening there. But that is really that's really all there is to it. So this is a really good example of the power of expressions inside of Xgen. The ability to take map information, combine it with slider information, and have that drive other attributes on your primitive shapes. It's just a very, very powerful feature inside of Maya. and it shows the extensibility of the tool set of Xgen with just a couple lines of expression code. We were able to do something pretty awesome, I think. So I'd like to thank you guys again for taking the time to watch the webinar. Please remember to go to the area and find my blog called The Desk, where you can get these expressions so that you don't have to try to write them out yourself, because that would be hard to do. And again, you just download them or copy and paste them into your window, and then you can use either the save expression once you've copied and pasted it into Xgen, or you can just put them into that directory that I showed you, and they'll be there the next time you open up the files. So thanks again, guys, and hopefully you'll find Xgen as fun as I have over the last bit here as I've been diving into it and trying to figure it out. Cheers.